Our guest on This is America and the World is Dr. Nikki Taylor. Dr. Taylor is Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at Howard University in Washington. Professor Taylor is also the author of Driven Toward Madness, The Fugitive Slave Margaret Garner and Tragedy on the Ohio. Dr. Taylor, welcome.
Thank you.
Why is it so darn hard to talk about race?
Well, that difficulty is born into the very fabric of American society, especially for topics that began so far in our nation's history. People don't want to talk about slavery. In order to talk about race, you have to talk about slavery.
You know, one of the things that I learned in my reading before our conversation, a huge difference between slaves and people who were enslaved. Huh?
Okay. You know, slavery or slaves is an older term now. Historians try to use the term enslaved to focus on the humanity and the fact that enslaved people had full, robust lives outside of the work that they did or the punishments they received. And so now historians are trying to use a more appropriate, politically correct term so that we don't lose or divest African Americans of their humanity in that period of time.
Back in Africa, all had a life, huh?
Well, yeah, you mean slavery in Africa? Yeah.
Well, but I mean just as Africans.
Yeah, well, as Africans, you know, although a lot of people on the continent didn't think of themselves as Africans in the age of slavery, they thought of themselves as belonging to their particular kin group or what we now call a tribe. And so, yeah, there were enslaved people even on the continent of Africa, but nothing at all is even remotely similar to what enslaved people endured in the New World.
There was a slave trade
Yes.
that kind of went around in circles. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so there was, we call it the triangular slave trade, and it basically moved people from the continent of Africa over to the New World where they would fulfill certain needs, labor, building cities and towns, and even, you know, tilling the fields, obviously. And then the other leg of it went from from Europe to Africa, and that's where Europeans traded certain goods with the Africans in order to get the enslaved people. So some of those goods that they traded were coffees, certain liquors, certain herbs and spices and things like that. And so they would take those to the continent, exchange them for cargo, or skins as they called it, which were enslaved Africans, or I should call them at that time, they were captive Africans, and then they were moved on slave ships over to the New World to fulfill a variety of needs to countless European nations.
How long a trip would that have been?
It would have been about, 40 days. 40 days, yeah, in the ships. We call those ships slavers.
So from Africa, not unusual to go into South America,
Right.
and then the Caribbean nations,
Oh, yeah.
and then here.
Yeah.
So so during the period of time, say like from the 1500s to the 1800s, how many people were trafficked?
Well, we don't have a correct number, but about 10 million is all we can, estimate, historians. And though that's a low estimate, some other historians would estimate it as high as 15 to 20 million. And so it was a significant, stripping of Africa of its best.
When we were in Haiti last year,
Okay.
and I got very interested in the history of Haiti. At one time they said that in Haiti, where some of the people ended up, there were 25,000 Europeans, 25,000 they called free colored,
Yeah.
and 700,000 slaves.
Yeah.
700,000.
Yeah. Is that shocking to you?
Yes.
Why so?
But I just can't believe the numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, that's as simple as that. I just
Yeah.
can't believe the numbers.
Yeah, the numbers are staggering. And a lot of the West Indian islands, including Haiti, there was what we call a black majority. And so the planters and people who own the land were often absentee owners, and they would spend the hot days in Europe or other places and then have black overseers to manage their land. Plantations.
I got 1,000 questions,
Okay.
but we need to take a little break. So
Okay.
let me tell the folks at home, I'm talking with Dr. Nikki Taylor. And Dr. Taylor is professor of history and also chair of the history department at Howard University. We have had a long, long history ourselves, and everything that I've done on television with the folks at WHUT at Howard University. So we're thrilled to have you here, Doctor. Take a little break. Back on the other side. This is America and the World. This is America and the World is brought to you by Japan. History, hospitality, and advanced technology sharing tomorrow. The Washington Diplomat, a world of news and perspective. The Sultanate of Oman. The U.S.-China Education Trust and F.Y. Chang Foundation, Julia Chang Block, President. The Rotondaro Family Trust. The Forerunner Foundation, dedicated to forward-thinking public policy. And the Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings. Dr. Taylor, when you're going to give a course in history to the students, and of course people think they know everything, you give a little test. What are some of the questions you ask on that little test before the course begins?
Right. Before the course begins, I have to do a pre-test because students, especially African Americans, think they know African American history. And so it depends on which course. If it's Black women's history, there'll be a different set of pre-test questions. But I ask certain things like name 4 major slave revolts in U.S. history. You know, how many free blacks lived in America before the Civil War, you know, in the age, we call it antebellum period. I might ask them for the name of 2 black intellectuals. And so they're usually really stumped because they thought they knew everything about their own history, but
why should, so you're talking about African American young people going to a history class.
Yeah.
What should white people know about African American history, and why should they know it?
Well, I think as much as African Americans know, white people should know. I think they should know first and foremost that African American history is central to U.S. history. I mean, you can't even understand U.S. history without understanding African American history.
Let me just interject here. Do people think it's kind of like, remember the signs were white this way and the color that way? Do people kind of think, well, there's U.S. history and there's African American history?
They do, and it takes sometimes an entire semester for students to understand my point. And that's a theme underlying most of my classes, is that this is American history. For example, how do you understand the Constitution without understanding African American history? There are more than 24 references to slavery in the Constitution, although they never say the word slavery. There's an omitted passage of the Declaration of Independence that nobody knows about or talks about. And in that omitted passage that Thomas Jefferson threw out at the last minute, he basically talks about the slave trade and how evil it was, but he blames King George for that. And so all of that is American history. You can't understand the history of American wars in this country. From the American Revolution, where Crispus Attucks was the first person to die, he was African American. You can't understand the history of the Civil War, World War I, World War II, or even how the U.S. moved westward. You won't even understand how the U.S. moved from the Mississippi River all the way to the Pacific Ocean without understanding African American history. Because, of course, African Americans were central to that acquisition of new territories out west. And so it's really sad to me when I hear people on television and whatever else who don't have a basic grasp of that aspect of American history. Because knowing it just enriches everything about your life and your world, how you navigate society, how you understand democracy. It was African Americans who made democracy such a more robust and dynamic concept. It was African Americans that pushed the boundaries of that. Of course, the founding fathers never envisioned African Americans to be part of their vision of a democracy. African Americans pushed the boundary. Why can't we have the right to vote? Why can't we have an amendment, the 14th Amendment, which expands the understanding of who is a citizen? And so all of these things about American democracy turn on the wheel of African American history.
In some ways, you could say economically
Yes.
that Africans built America.
Definitely, and there have been plenty of historians who have argued just that, who argued that the underpinnings of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, and even the movement in the 20s to industrialize with car factories and all of that was central. All of that, African Americans were central to that entire history. Even unionization and you know, A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters taught Americans how to organize, how to march on Washington. So it's just such a rich history.
Going back to, you dropped Thomas Jefferson. We're talking about the Declaration of Independence and knowing at the same time that they come up with this 3/5 idea.
Yeah.
And Jefferson himself owning 200 slaves, huh?
Yes, that's true. And there were so many of the founding fathers, not all, but many of them who were living a contradictory life. Like they were expressing anti-slavery sentiments, but yet they owned slaves, or they were, you know, talking about black inferiority. Thomas Jefferson did that, one of the fathers of scientific racism. That's a sidebar. So they're talking about scientific racism and blacks' innate inferiority, but yet you're sleeping with a black woman and fathering children with her. So it was just such a hypocritical moment in American history when it comes to the founding fathers. They're talking about freedom in these founding documents, freedom for all, and yet a large part of the nation's enslaved.
Not freedom for all, huh?
Right.
There's so much we can talk about,
Right.
and so much we've already talked about, but put on, we'll focus in on one person.
Okay.
Tell me about Margaret Garner
Okay.
and the drive to madness.
Yes. Margaret Garner is the subject of my third book. And Margaret Garner was an enslaved young woman, about my daughter's age. She was 23 years old, living in northern Kentucky, where she was enslaved by a man named Archibald K. Gaines. He was not a planter, but he owned a number of slaves, and he operated a farm. She worked perpetually around the clock, tending to his children, the needs of his aged mother, his own needs, and the needs of his wife and his children. And she also had to tend to her own needs. She had a husband who lived on another farm down the road. She had 4 children by the age of 23 and was pregnant with her 5th. And so in many ways, the only way I could summarize her life, she had had it with you know, her enslavement in Richwood, Kentucky. And so in January of 1856, Margaret Garner, along with her entire intact family, her husband, her 4 children, and her husband's parents, they decided to strike for freedom. And so they escaped from their Richwood farms, and they walked, or they took a sleigh, I should say, 16 miles in the dead of winter. And back then, northern Kentucky and Ohio were just brutally cold. And they made it 16 miles. It took them the entire night to get to the bank of the Kentucky, banks of the northern Kentucky, which is the divide between Ohio and Kentucky was the Ohio River. They walked across the frozen river because that was the only way they could get across, is by walking. So that, you know, sometimes enslaved people intentionally waited until the river was frozen. As soon as they got to Cincinnati on the other side, where Margaret had a cousin who had, you know, kind of was planning to assist her family, her owner caught up with her. He had grabbed some self-styled deputies, and they proceeded to batter in the door of Margaret Garner's cousin's home. And her husband, who had carried a pistol with him on his escape, he decided to fire at these white men, which was suicidal, to say it at best. To fire at white men in mid-century 1850s was absolutely suicidal.
These were the slave catchers.
Yes, well, and self-styled deputies, because remember, under the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, any random white men could be enlisted to help as deputies. They were deputized under that law. And so there was a melee at the door, and Margaret Garner, sensing the walls of freedom were, the doors were closing, she grabbed a knife and slit the throat of her 2-year-old daughter. And she exclaimed that she'd rather have them die than to go back to slavery. So then she proceeded to try to kill all of her children that day. And her life really just underscores how horrific and damaging slave was. Even in Kentucky, which is never associated with the plantation South that we think of. We think of cotton production and cotton plantations. She's just on a regular farm in America. And even that was so horrific to her that she couldn't even countenance or stomach a return to an enslaved past. So that's why she killed her children, or killed her daughter. And I talk about that in my last book, and how the choice is not between slavery and freedom, but between slavery and death.
Huge trial.
Yeah.
People came, and the arguments were, was she a murderess?
Yeah, so everybody, it was clear. She admitted she murdered the baby. But because we were in an age of slavery, Ohio, which was a free state, wanted to prosecute her as a murderer, right? And they figured she would do a few years and be free after that. Kentucky wanted her to be remanded to her owner so that she could be charged. She was charged with being a fugitive slave, which in society's minds at the time was equal to being charged with murder. So the states battled over who should have Margaret Garner's body, who had a rightful cause to have her body. Kentucky won, and she was sent back to slavery without ever facing charges for murder. And on the Ohio River, her owner he was very duplicitous, so he basically sent her further down the river to a plantation in Mississippi. And on that journey, number 2, her second daughter died when the steamboat clashed with another one. And so she lost 2 daughters within a month's period of time. And so some people think that she had something to do with the second one. But at the end of the day, she may and she may not have. But the thing that the thread that runs through this whole story is the possibility that her owner was the father of the 2 daughters. And so that story just really exemplifies America at the time. What it meant to be a black woman, what it meant to be an enslaved black woman, what it meant to have children in slavery, what it meant for 2 states to come to, such contentious situation, Ohio and Kentucky, slave state and free state. And so it kind of represents and foretold of the Civil War in a lot of ways.
Thank you for sharing her story. And also, I did have a question as to, it kind of tells a huge piece of slavery right in her own story, doesn't it? Huh?
It does. And I talk about what it meant to be enslaved on a smaller farm and how, it was like she was totally and perpetually in service to people her entire 23 years. And so I think it kind of challenges the narrative that slavery was, people assume, slavery was good in some places. We treated our slaves well. And so her story suggests that that isn't true.
Where does this whole idea of, well, maybe it's obvious and maybe the question doesn't need to be asked, this whole idea of white being superior and dark or black being inferior, that just is...
Yeah, that's really a great question. It's very complicated. 2 scholars, Winthrop Jordan and also Ibrahim Kendi, who's at American, have tried to unpack the roots of modern racism and white supremacy. And so both books are fabulous in their own rights. But basically, we know that it was around the 15th century, 15th, 16th century, that these racist ideas and notions of black inferiority emerged. Certain people perpetuated them and propelled them and made them a living thing. And so, you know, it's a complicated story, and it's probably too long of a story to tell here, but I'll say that there were notions of black inferiority that date at least as far back as Leo Africanus's work. He was a traveler who, you know, said all kinds of things. He said a lot of good things that give us insight into what Africa was like, but he also said a lot of damning things. And then you have people who perpetuated that, including Pope and King James and other people, King James of the Bible fame, and Shakespeare, and all of these people who we still today celebrate as authors of our greatest, you know, works that we, you know, that we value, the Bible and Shakespearean plays, and yet they're troubled. These works are troubled with, you know, these notions of black inferiority.
Is it hard to be black in America today?
It depends on what class you're in and how educated you are. It's not easy for anybody, but there are degrees of this. Yeah, degrees to this. And I would say that I've, you know, because of my education, have escaped a lot of things, but there's some things that it's impossible for me to escape. Me in the criminal justice system, I'm sure, would have similar, if not the same consequences as an uneducated black woman. And so there's some things that, you know, no matter how educated you are, no matter what schools you go to, you cannot really fully ever escape race. And so I have now embraced that idea and have found ways to live under this harrowing, you know, veil or shadow of white supremacy and racism.
Do you run into incidents where you feel that you've been discriminated against?
Every single day. Every single day. And it's exhausting.
Give me an example.
It could be, I mean, do you want local examples or larger ones?
You personally.
Me personally, you know, housing is a really bad issue in DC and beyond. Just trying to navigate the housing market. If you dare to have the desire to live in a nice area with coffee shops and libraries and things like that, then you have a more difficult time getting into such locations. And that's kind of disturbing. That's probably the #1 way that I've felt discrimination. Policing, having police, not so much in DC, but you know, I'm from Ohio. So having police unfairly stop me just because I'm in a nice car.
Have you been stopped?
Oh, countless times. I've been assaulted by police. It's really, you know, really shocking.
How do you handle the hurt, or the frustration, or the anger?
Yeah, well, I'm very spiritual, and so I work that out spiritually. I also have a little rule where I call at least 3 people and talk about the incident, and that kind of takes a lot of the stress away. But I noticed over time that the years of compounded stress of all these petty microaggressions, and some of them larger, like the housing situation, they compound in a way that just, you know, affect your body and your long-term health. I've watched my daughter endure educational discrimination from the public schools of New York, where they try to track her, to schools that, you know, just refuse to let her into honors programs. And it's been exhausting. She's now in medical school, so I can't say the racism is insurmountable, but oh my God, you have to have so much energy to just live in America, just to do the things that normal people do. And so we're here, she's in medical school, some would mark me as a success, but she and I know, my daughter and I both know how many tears were cried to get us both in those positions. And so it's exhausting, and I've tried at one point, I left America, I moved to Africa, and I lived there for a year, and I missed America. And so I found myself saying, wait a minute, what's going on with me? Here I've escaped racism, which I always said was my #1 obstacle, but there are certain things that I missed. And so I came back, obviously, and I decided to make my lot here and try to fight it with every fiber that I have. And so that's what makes it exhausting. I don't let any racist act, no matter how big or small, left unchallenged. I don't allow that, because I understand that because I've been given a lot of opportunities and blessings in terms of writing skills and speaking skills, that I have to be the one, in case there's somebody else that doesn't have what I have. I have to be the one to challenge these systemic and institutional and individual acts of bigotry and white supremacy.
Dr. Taylor, we're lucky to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the education.
No
Thank
problem.
you.
I've enjoyed myself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For information about This Is America and the World, visit our website, thisisamerica.net, or our YouTube channel, This Is America TV, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. You can listen to all of our ambassador interviews on our podcast, The Ambassador Series. It's available on our website and iTunes. This Is America and the World is brought to you by Japan, History, Hospitality, and Advanced Technology, Sharing Tomorrow. The Washington Diplomat, a world of news and perspective. The Sultanate of Oman. The U.S.-China Education Trust and F.Y. Chang Foundation, Julia Chang Block, President. The Rotondaro Family Trust. The Forerunner Foundation, dedicated to forward-thinking public policy. And the Embassy Series, uniting people through musical diplomacy, presenting international artists in diplomatic settings.